I have the pleasure of getting introduced today's seminar speaker, Maddie Zuercher, a recently finished PhD student from my lab. And I could say lots of wonderful things about Maddie because she's a really wonderful person. I think but I don't want to take up much of her time. So I'm going to limit my comments to like how amazing she is and was as a graduate student and as a person and as a graduate student, but specifically about her graduate student qualities, which I would say you could sort of summarize, well, including the three words that I was thinking of: resourceful, um, resourceful and resilient and adaptable. And this, she came in at a time just before the COVID pandemic, really. She had a fully formed project idea. She had gotten everything she needed to carry it out. She had acquired the funding that she needed, mostly from, applying for small grants, and was all ready to do her research when the COVID pandemic derailed it. All right. But she was absolutely unflappable. Like, you couldn't tell that it bothered her at all, which is amazing. And, she came out of the COVID pandemic, not just with one project, but with two, because she had this sort of backup plan or backup project she carried out when she couldn't do the research she was planning to do. And that turned into a viable project as well. So she's going to be telling you about both of those projects today, one on ringtails, the other on gray foxes. And anyway, let's give her a wet round of applause at the beginning here. It's going to be a great countdown.
All right, thank you so much, Greg. And can everyone hear me all right? Am I projecting? Okay. So thank you everyone for coming today to help me celebrate the end of my doctorate. And today I'm going to share my research on how introduced carnivores impact native carnivore behaviors. But I know that so many people here today aren't necessarily as interested in the carnivores as they are. I'm hearing about my journey over the past 6 years. So my goal for this talk was to inject a lot of my own narrative into the story. As Greg said, I definitely encountered plenty of path redirections and challenges, and sometimes I had to go with plan B, C, and D. So sort of an alternate, talk title today is about my challenges, triumphs, and all of the little happy accidents that happened along the way. So for those of you who knew me 6 years ago, you probably knew me as a bat biologist. I studied bat community ecology in Peru, disease ecology in Iowa, and I studied fruit bat behavior and dental evolution at UC Berkeley. And a lot of these studies fit really nicely and neatly into these different categories like ecology, behavior, evolution, and conservation. But for my graduate work, I realized I wanted to do projects that were extremely integrative. And while I really loved bats, I was also happy to explore other taxa. So that's when I encountered my advisors, Greg and Deborah. Greg was a behavioral ecologist who studied interspecific interactions, like interference competition. And Deborah was a conservation biologist with a plethora of mammal-oriented study systems. So I felt like this would be a really great match for me. Then I learned that one of the projects that Deborah was working on was on a species called a ringtail. The ringtail is incredibly elusive and enigmatic and honestly just so adorable that I knew no matter what happened in this project, I was going to tough it out. So this mammal lives throughout a lot of the southwestern US and Mexico. And I was really all in on designing a project that was going to work for me. Because I was really interested in community ecology and animal behavior and conservation and, the lens of global change, I started thinking about projects I could design that would integrate all of those aspects. And these spheres overlapped in one really intriguing area to me, and that's invasion biology. So it got me thinking about how non-native carnivores might impact the communities that they are invading, not just as predators, but as competitors, disease vectors, and more. And that inspired my review, Beyond Predation, the ecological impacts of those introduced carnivores on their native predators. So here I'm focusing on carnivores And when you think about introduced carnivores, you're probably first going to think about the human-associated carnivores, like domestic dogs, domestic cats, maybe even raccoons, the animals that are sort of anthropogenically associated. But in the literature, I found 7 main species that have been studied. So the dog, the cat, the raccoon, but also the American mink is invasive in a lot of Europe. The red fox is also considered invasive, as is the raccoon dog, and the small Indian civet in some parts. So while all of those species are really charismatic, um, as predators, as introduced predators, they can really wreak havoc on ecosystems. And introduced carnivores are really a top cause of biodiversity loss of a lot of small vertebrates, especially. Most of the research focuses on their predation impacts, and that's rightfully so. Cats alone have caused over 60 extinctions of small mammal species, likely due to the sort of naivete of a lot of those species to ambush predators like them. The same is true for dogs. Dogs are impactful worldwide. And despite public support of these animals, even popular science articles like these are calling attention to this really big issue. A lot of the research is focusing on those predation impacts, but they can have non-predation impacts as well, like disease transmission, interference competition, exploitation competition, and other things. And those impacts really deserve attention because they can affect other predator species, and that can have cascading ecosystem effects. And a lot of times those larger species can be really hard to recover once they've been impacted. So there's numerous mechanisms that I'll cover really briefly here. When species interact, they might be exploiting similar resources like space, time, or food items. They may be reproductively interfering. So for that, we can think about like hybridization. They could interfere with each other aggressively through something like territoriality or intraspecific killing. Sometimes these animals will kill each other and consume them, but sometimes it's just aggression and killing. And there's also a lot of potential for parasite and pathogen transmission. So if you think about canine distemper, rabies, those are diseases that can easily travel from our, domestic dogs or other invasive carnivores to the wildlife populations. The immediate effects of these things are perhaps displacement in space and time. So maybe home ranges might shrink or expand. Ranges of species can shift. They might switch from being nocturnal to diurnal. They might also change their diet and what they're eating. Through the aggression, they might just be encountering physiological stress, and that might be impacting their reproduction, their survival, their health, and overall, this can reduce their fitness. And so why does that matter? These have really big consequences for our native wildlife. It can cause declines in population size and density, which can impact all of the community. It can also cause evolution of some traits, evolution of behaviors, of morphology, or it could even lead to extirpation, so the localized extinction of a species. So when I dug into this literature, I found that the invasion biology literature of predators and their impacts on their competitors and other predators is about 20 years old, give or take. And a lot of the literature focuses on insular locations. So why might that be? Is that a bias in where people like to study, or is that an actual artifact of invasion biology? And it turns out to be the latter. A lot of times in sort of insular ecosystems, there might not be as much experience that they have, that animals have with other predator species. And so they might not have adaptive responses to those species. So when predators invade, they might not have anti-predator defenses, and there might not be existing predators to compete with them. A lot of these studies evaluated changes to predator space use, almost half of them did, but there are plenty of other impactful and interesting effects of predator invasions. So many of you probably already know that dogs and wolves can hybridize, but in fact, dogs can hybridize with all sorts of dog-like species like jackals and coyotes. They look a little funny. One interesting study for my dental evolution friends was on Finnish red foxes. And they found that after the invasion of raccoon dogs to Finland, the canine teeth of the carnassials there of the female red foxes evolved. And they evolved to match the changes in diets that were caused by competition with those red foxes. This change occurred over less than a century, which is really rapid evolution. And this is a really interesting case. I want to share one more case that really resonated with me that spanned several of these different effects, like space, time, behavior, and health. So in the southern UK, the American mink became invasive. In the waterways there, they consumed mostly fish and they were active at night. And then something happened. The conservationists reintroduced the native European polecat. And these two species overlap a lot in their niches. So what do you think happened? Actually, the invasive species switched a lot of its ecology. It ended up eating less fish, and it became diurnal instead of nocturnal. And overall, the researchers observed that they had poorer body condition after the native species was introduced. But why did those results emerge? Was it due to the polecat being better at fishing, so the mink had to eat more birds, and that made them more diurnal? Or maybe it was that the polecat was aggressive, which made the mink diurnal, and that resulted in them changing their diet. There could be a lot of different ways that that could go. And that led me to identifying some bigger gaps in the literature. So to me, this highlighted a need for identifying the behavioral mechanisms that underlie the patterns that we're already observing. While we have all of those patterns that have emerged over time, we often don't understand the mechanisms underlying them. So is it interference, is it exploitation, or is it something else that caused these changes? Another thing I realized that might be lacking in the literature are the impacts of introduced species separate from the impacts of urbanization writ large. And I think this is important. Would a bear that lived adjacent to a neighborhood have a different experience if the neighborhood was filled with dogs versus if there were no dogs there? I think that introduced carnivores introduce a lot of stimuli that change the experience of animals near urban wildlife interfaces. And lastly, there were just a few examples of non-negative interactions that were really intriguing. In one case, they found that these European badgers dug dens as homes, and then those same dens were used by the invasive raccoon dogs. The researchers posited that that's a big reason why raccoon dogs were able to invade. Without the badger dens, they weren't equipped to survive in this region. And so the badgers are actually facilitating the invasion of the raccoons. And clearly those interactions deserve a lot more attention if they have big impacts on conservation like that. So for my dissertation work, I attempted to address some of the gaps in our understanding of the behavioral mechanisms at urban wildlife interfaces, especially. So like Greg mentioned, I started to do a pilot study in the Santa Monica Mountains because I had these really grand plans to study ringtails in Mexico and needed to hit pause. So my goal was to find the ringtail in our local Santa Monica Mountains and conduct my pilot. These mountains are the ancestral territories of the Chumash and the Gabrielino Tongva people, and they're mostly chaparral and oak woodland habitat, which should be really great for the ringtails here. And we do have a really rich carnivore community. To detect ringtails, I put out strawberry jam at a lot of different sites. This is a tried and true way of attracting this species. And I set up camera traps at many of these locations around the mountains. So these trail cameras take a photo and then a video as soon as they're triggered by motion in front of the camera. All right, and where did I find the ringtails? Absolutely nowhere. They were not very cooperative. I know that they're there. We know that they're there, but they were not cooperating. And I was so disappointed when I checked my cameras day after hike with no ringtails. But what I did find was fox after fox after fox after fox after fox after fox. So the foxes were everywhere and they loved the bait. They would consistently visit the cameras at almost all of my locations, and sometimes they would even come in pairs. So I thought this is a really cool opportunity to take advantage of my cooperative study species. Something I noticed when I was doing all of my hikes to check my cameras is that the foxes were in a lot of different locations, but there were some big differences between those locations. Some sites were managed for general recreation, and I regularly saw dozens of dogs on those hikes, sometimes a single person walking a dozen dogs. Other sites like Stunt Ranch and the state parks were managed in a way that didn't allow for any of the dogs in the parks to sort of protect the nature. And you can imagine that if you are a fox, that is a very different sensory experience. The presence of the dogs creates a very different environment, right? So dogs can alter the environment in many ways. They can disturb the habitat, they could be noisy, and occasionally people will leave the dog poop bags out. And regardless of how well your dog is behaved in these habitats, they're likely to urine mark everywhere, right? And this urine marking is particularly important to note because the scent can exist for hours to weeks after they leave it. And scent marking is how carnivores communicate. They learn about their neighbors' identities and territories. And from these observations, I took my pilot study, rearranged it, and made it into my real dissertation project on how domestic dog scent affects gray fox behavior at the urban wildlife interface. So under normal circumstances, if a gray fox detects the scent of another species, we might assume that they have evolved adaptive responses to that. For example, if they smell a predator, it may lead to an escape sequence. If they smell prey, they might want to pursue them. However, gray foxes didn't evolve with dogs, so they might not behave adaptively to their cues. So my overarching question for this work was, yeah, I took this from a camera trap. This is the best photo I got. My overarching research question was, how do dogs affect gray fox behaviors? And I broke this down in a couple ways. First, I was interested in how dog scent affects gray foxes. We might imagine that they would react as though they were recognizing a competitor. So they might behave territorially, countermarking, visiting the site more and more to defend their territories. We might also expect them to detect the threat, right? Dogs and coyotes are closely related. Perhaps they might be interpreting the dog scent as a coyote scent. I also wanted to detect whether the responses varied between different types of parks. So was their experience with or without dogs informing their responses to dog scent? So we studied gray fox behaviors at 6 sites where dogs are permitted with the yellow triangles and 4 sites where dogs are banned with the blue circles. And this is all in the Santa Monica Mountains of Southern California, just outside of Los Angeles. So this was the setup for our equipment at each site. The camera traps took a 20-second video and a photo when they were triggered, and we used tuna and strawberry jam as bait. We added the tuna because some of the foxes didn't seem like they were interested in the strawberries, so we might have some more carnivorous foxes, I guess. And near the bait, I tied a paper plate with vegetation on it, and then I added a scent cue. Oh, hey, Felicia, can you add people from the waiting room? Okay, thanks. All right, and here's our experimental design. At each site, we had 6 trials, and the trials lasted 3 nights each. 3 of those trials were controls, and 3 were with dog scent. So what did I use for the dog scent? I emailed some people at the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine and asked them if they could send me dog urine from their from their dog colonies, and they said yes. So I took all of those dog urine samples and I mixed them into 3 different exemplars. The reason that I mixed them is to sort of mimic what it might be like for a dog walking on the trail to repeatedly mark in the same areas, and so that we weren't testing for responses to just one dog, but to dogs in general. The criteria for these dogs, they were all spayed or neutered, they were all over 50 pounds, and they were of mixed breed types. The results of the experiment, we had to run through a program called Boris, and all of my students will recognize the name Boris and probably groan because we went through a lot of photos and videos, and we were looking for different behaviors. So we would use an ethogram, or a list and description of behaviors, to look for foraging, vigilance behaviors, digging and sniffing, and that sort of thing. So what did we see? Some of them did this. So you can see the fox checking out the rock, and then he gets on it and pees. And then he goes and eats the bait again. All right. Here's another video in the daytime. This one just briefly marks the plate, counter marking. And this was a really interesting behavior. This fox would rub its face on the plate of dog pee. So perhaps counter marking or even acquiring the scent of the dog. So we saw some really interesting and extremely varied behaviors. So what was our overall result? So from our 196 observations, we found the effects of dog scent on 2 gray fox behaviors. The first was foraging. So here on our x-axis, we have the treatment, so whether it received the control or the dog urine, and then there's the percent of observations where we saw that behavior occur. In both types of sites, when we introduced the control treatment, they usually foraged, right? So about 70% of the time they would be consuming the bait when they were visiting the site. When we introduced the dog urine, that shifted a little, particularly at sites where dogs are not allowed. So you can see that the probability that they forage decreased from 70% to around 50%. There was one other behavior that we found to be different, and that is sniffing. So in control trials, the foxes were often sniffing, around 70% of the time. So they were investigating their environment. And my expectation is that when we introduce this novel scent, that they would want to sniff more. But they didn't. At both sites, they sniffed less. So why might that be? Well, dogs and other canids are really good at smelling. They don't really need to put their nose straight up to something to tell that it's there. So likely foxes can detect that there's dog scent, and if they choose to do the act of sniffing and investigating, that's to get more information. And that's typically an investigative behavior. So overall, we found that gray foxes were less likely to eat the bait and to investigate the environment when they detected dogs. And our results were consistent with the threat recognition hypothesis. When they detect that there's dog scent, they're less likely to eat the bait, less likely to investigate. So why did we think this was? While they may not have evolved a response to dogs, they could be responding to a similar type of scent. So like I said earlier, dogs and coyotes can interbreed. They're very similar. And while they have unique signatures to their urine, there could be a lot of similarities that the foxes have evolved to pick up on. So overall, we found that responses to dog cues and from introduced species in general can be generalized. And there's no strong evidence of habituation to dog activity, which meant that all gray foxes were affected, no matter if they were in parks where they were more pristine. All right, so how is that relevant to park management? Our parks manage dogs and other recreation in a variety of ways. Some will prevent all dogs in the area to the best they can. Others provide mutt mitts to pick up dog poop. There's also leash laws and things like that. And management decisions really depend on like for whom or what you're managing for. So if park managers are managing for mountain lions, a lot of evidence says that the presence of people is not that different from the presence of people and dogs. The mountain lions see that as similar. But that's not true for gray foxes. Gray foxes are picking up on these scents and behaving differently. So in areas where we need to be especially sensitive to gray foxes, we need to keep in mind that it's not just people, it's not just bikes, it's also our dogs that are affecting their behaviors. But I learned more than science from this project. I learned that doing this local field work that I didn't anticipate doing at first was deeply meaningful. I built a lot of great relationships with people in LA and around LA, and I was able to take a lot of students out in the field to do this work. We created side projects from this, and for some people that are from LA, this was, and that was really meaningful to me. Lastly, we got some cool observations. I detected 2 mountain lions that were collared, and that was really fun. Sadly, both of those mountain lions passed away a few months after I detected them on camera, but it was a very meaningful experience for me to be in the same environment as them and studying how our park policies are affecting wildlife like them. And lastly, for this project, I want to give a shout out to one of my students who worked on an interesting side project on the weekend effect. He was studying how the different behaviors of people and their dogs on the weekends might affect gray fox temporal activity or when they're active during the night. And he actually found that on the weekends, gray fox activity spikes at 4 p.m. and 11 p.m. That's really interesting stuff. It's very preliminary. It was only at one park, but it provides interesting fodder for us to think about how we're affecting these foxes. And while I was doing this project, I was always thinking about the ringtails and trying to get back. And eventually, through a lot of small grants and grit, we worked out a project on island endemic ringtails in Mexico. And that's what I would like to share with you next. So when I was talking with folks about ringtails, I discovered that there are some islands in the Gulf of California where ringtails live with feral cats and no other native carnivores. That was so interesting to me because feral cats are known to threaten biodiversity, especially in these smaller island ecosystems. The cats were introduced to these areas usually by fisher folk who use them as rodent control or as pets. And these 2 photos were taken at my study site where we did our field research. So the cats were introduced over the past century and they continue to be a management concern. And this area is very well protected. So 30 years ago, this archipelago called Espiritu Santo was purchased from developers and became a federally protected land due to its cultural and biodiversity value. Something really important and interesting to note is that this is the site where one of the oldest fish hooks made of seashells has been discovered. So it's very important to the former Pericue peoples of this area and to people today who enjoy it for ecotourism and for spiritual value. This site is very beautiful. The terrain is rocky. The climate is generally arid, so it's great for ringtails. And these photos were actually taken just after the rainy season, which is why it's so green. Much of the land is off limits to people, but there are around 20 beaches, some of which are heavily visited by ecotourism agencies. But those tourists can really only explore this small land area on the beach. There are no permanent structures or residents there, but the fisherfolk and the tourists do camp in tents or shacks on the beach. So this is the ranger station. This is sort of the extent of the infrastructure there. And these feral cats pose a threat to many small vertebrates on the islands. So the islands are home to 6 endemic mammals, including 4 rodents, a jackrabbit, and the ringtail. The ringtail subspecies is locally called the babisuri, which sort of indicates how special it is. They distinguish these ringtails from other ringtails. It's a really endearing name that's used by locals. And while some folks have posited that cats are impacting these species, there hadn't yet been any studies on their effects. And past efforts to manage cats have been limited due to the difficult terrain and accessibility. So understanding how the cats are actually affecting these species is going to help managers evaluate their priorities. So like I said earlier, there are no other native carnivores on this island. So we have the feral cats and the ringtails. They overlap somewhat in their ecology. So the ringtails are usually nocturnal. They have an omnivorous diet and they're pretty small. Cats are typically crepuscular and have a more carnivorous diet and are larger than the ringtails. So given these similarities and their relatively recent introduction, our team wanted to investigate how they interact. On the mainland, ringtails typically avoid other carnivores because they're kind of small and they don't have a lot of, don't have like sharp claws or really big teeth and jaws. Though it's possible that ringtails retain some anti-predator behaviors, but it's also possible that they've lost them. So I was interested in exploring whether these ringtails and the cats might be interacting on the island. And so I did a brief experiment at home. I was gifted a stuffed ringtail and I introduced it to my cat. And sure enough, he was so aggressive with it. It was really hard to watch. So this led to my research questions on how feral cats affect ringtail ecology and behavior. And I was evaluating whether they might retain recognition for competitors or predators, or whether there was relaxed selection on them. This took a lot of field work. We camera trapped at 23 beta. I visited 8 times over 17 months. These are my collaborators, Fernando and Liz. And they were with me every step of the way, and I really couldn't have done this without them. So we found that ringtails were everywhere. We detected them on our cameras 7,000 times. And we also detected the antelope squirrels and the black jackrabbits and even the feral goats that are there. Okay, what about the cats? The cats were not cooperating. Yet again, we only detected cats 9 times from our camera traps. So this is likely reflective of low detection probability instead of low abundance. And we believe this because where we did see cats, they were completely uninterested in the bait and the lure, the bait, anything like that, they were uninterested. So we don't think that those methods are going to reliably detect cats on camera. So how can we do that? Can we figure out another plan? So Greg talked to Paul Barber and he suggested maybe using eDNA. And I said, that sounds like it's worth a try. So we went to the beaches and we collected sand from paw prints that we saw on the beach. And I thought this is a great idea because the sand, they're leaving indentations, they're probably shedding their DNA. So they're leaving environmental DNA or eDNA for me to pick up. So we collected DNA, presumably from all of these different paw prints at different beaches, came back to the lab and extracted and amplified the DNA. And do you think we found mammal DNA? No, not really. This sand did not seem to be a great substrate for the DNA. Typically, mammals are better detected from water sources, and there just aren't very many water sources on this island. So I think this method will use a lot of workshopping before applying it to the system. But the experience was worthwhile. All right, plan C. I know that there are people that visit these islands. The people visit them all the time, every week, sometimes every day. They spend nights on the islands. So we created and distributed surveys to the ecotourism guides and to the park rangers to supplement our camera trap data. And this worked. We found that there were cat observations at several of the locations. So all of the triangles are feral cat observations. And all of these circles are ringtail observations. And while this is an imperfect measure of where feral cats exist on the island, it gave us a pretty good idea and a good place to start. A lot of the places where the feral cat observations are corresponded with areas where there are like fishing camps or other places where they might have been introduced to begin with. So we took all of our camera trap data on ringtail activity, and we wanted to compare activity between the sites with and without the confirmed cat presence. So at sites without cats, as far as we know, we see that ringtail activity looks a little bit like this. So they start becoming active right around sunset, and they're pretty consistently active throughout the night, and that drops off right before sunrise. So if that doesn't change with the introduction of cats at these other sites, we should see the same distribution. What we found instead is that at sites with cats, their activity was peaking around midnight. This was really interesting because mainland feral cats are typically crepuscular, and we can kind of assume this to be true on the islands as well, we hope. It would be great if we had those data though. But if this is true, this result shows that ringtails are shifting to become more nocturnal, perhaps to avoid the crepuscular cats at the beaches where they co-occur. So this is really interesting, and I wanted to get more at the behavior behind why that might be occurring. So we performed another scent experiment. This time, instead of dog urine, we used cat urine provided by my research assistants, and still we analyzed the data in Boris and ran generalized linear mixed effects models. Our setup looked like this. So our scent treatment was typically on the paper plate like last time in a little grass pellet. And then we set out bait, which was, again, the tuna and the strawberry jam. Okay, so here's one of those videos of a ringtail eating the jam out of a seashell to keep it around longer. And you can really see him kind of manipulating the shell and digging in with his paws. And we saw some interesting behaviors from these videos as well. So here's a ringtail kit playing with its mother until she finally throws him off. So this time we got 206 observations. And again, my students churned through a lot of those videos and annotated those behaviors. And so what did we find? Our main result was tied to digging. So again, we have control and then the cat urine treatment on the x-axis. And at sites where we had the control treatment, quarter of the time. That changed when we introduced the cat urine. They were about half as likely to dig. And this is really interesting. Ringtails are related to raccoons, and while they're not quite as nimble with their hands, they're able to unscrew bottle caps, open coolers, unzip tents, and they're very dexterous. So digging and using their tactile senses is how ringtails investigate their environment. And the decline in digging behavior could indicate that the cat scent is decreasing ringtails' inclination to explore their surroundings. So we found that ringtails were more nocturnal at sites where cats were present, and they were less likely to investigate their surroundings when they detected cat scent. Overall, this indicates to us that they retain their competitor recognition and avoidance behaviors despite prolonged isolation from other mammalian carnivores. So what does this mean for the people who are managing and conserving nature on the islands? Well, in our surveys, we also asked questions about conservation values and priorities of the people who live and work around the islands. We found that ringtails were considered highly favorable. They loved the ringtails there, and they really detested the cats. So there's already high local support for managing only for the ringtails, versus maybe in LA, that might be a little bit more difficult due to people's attachment to their pets. We also asked about their conservation values, and we found that nature conservation is ranked the highest along with tourism. And ringtails are good for tourism, with other ventures ranking lower than that. So now that we know how they are starting to affect the other carnivores on the island, we can definitely say that they're having an impact, not just on their prey species, but on other predator species. And with their limited scope so far, there might still be a chance to manage them in time before things get out of control in this really rocky and hard to navigate terrain. I also worked with some students while we didn't go to Mexico to do this work. I was able to bring data back. I worked with Ellie Gonzalez, and she was studying the predictors behind whether ringtails are reproducing in certain areas. We had a lot of pictures of babies and lactating females. And so she was able to describe the habitats where we're more likely to see those. I also worked with Holly Hebden to study all of those other mammal species, like the jackrabbits, the goats, and the antelope squirrels, to describe their activity patterns as it relates to moon phase and nightly temperatures. And lastly, we had a little natural history surprise. So on one of our cameras, we got super lucky, and a ringtail dragged a porcupine fish in front of our camera and started eating it. And this was really surprising, A, because ringtails had never been recorded to eat fish before, probably because they just typically don't live in areas that are, I don't know, fish heavy, that are near streams and oceans as much. However, it could have been possible. But the more interesting thing to me is that porcupine fish are toxic. They have toxic spines and organs. And we saw ringtails at this same location later that are presumably the same individual, but it's hard to say. So this was a really special observation. I'll just show you the beginning of this video. So you can see that he's sort of nibbling off camera, and then he drags it right into view and starts tearing into it from the back. He sort of opens it at the tail and slurps out whatever's in there. So that was a really exciting observation for us. Probably the biggest thing I learned from this project is how valuable and how strong collaboration can make the project. I had a ton of support from other people for this project, and those are friendships that will be lifelong. And this has been really fruitful for all of us, and I'm very thankful to, especially to Liz and Fernando, for all of the work that they did for this project also. Overall, in my dissertation, I learned a lot about science, mostly about how unpredictable it can be and how flexible and adaptable we need to be in these natural systems. Also, I learned to respect that there are things that I will never know. There are animal behaviors that will never make sense to me. And to also just stop and enjoy what we're doing when we're doing it. A lot of times I would get bogged down into thinking about the result that I needed. I need a fox to appear on camera. I need to find this. I need to find that. But every now and then I would make these observations. Like when I was driving home one day, I saw a coyote just right next to the car. When I was at Stunt Ranch, I saw this caterpillar sort of mid-chrysalis. And those moments really make me stop and appreciate how valuable these experiences are and how lucky we are to be able to study them in places where this nature is still intact. I also learned a lot about my community and how important that is. My community, such as the mentorship program and VOCIS and the movement ecology group, really held me during this whole time and kept me excited about science and sharing science and learning new things. Everyone provided me so much academic and emotional and just practical support during my research. And with that, I'd like to thank my funding sources. Most of my funding came from a lot of small grants that were pieced together. I think my research cost $22,000, and I think 80% of that came from small grants from all of these places. And lastly, I'd like to thank all of my community, my family and friends and research assistants, my advisors and committee especially, my collaborators, and all of you and all of my support network that was here. That was really hard to fit on this page. So thank you so much for all of your support. It means the world to me. And I think I have time for questions. Hi, Nuri.
Amazing presentation, and I know a little about your research, but it's so fascinating. And my question is not a particularly advanced scientific question, but I'm just very curious about this dog pee approach.
Yeah.
You know, having had dogs and knowing very little about fox behavior, dogs tend to go and mark places where lots of dogs have marked. And I'm wondering if the mix of pee created that sense of like a frequently visited spot, and whether you think that might have changed things versus an individual dog pee, and whether foxes exhibit similar behavior of like marking many individuals.
So Nurit's question was about having a lot of different or urine samples from a lot of different dogs in this same mixture that I set out, and whether that was recreating what they might experience from other foxes, right? Or practically experience. So the reason that I mixed them all together is because I thought that that would best replicate what they would experience from other dogs. And like you said, dogs typically countermark over each other over and over again in specific places. So I thought that that would best reflect their actual experiences. As far as what foxes and other carnivores might do themselves, typically animals like foxes and ringtails will mark the same areas over and over again. But I think what's different from dogs is that it's usually not all the individuals in the area are marking one specific spot. That's typically what happens in our neighborhood, at least. But for foxes, they're typically marking around the perimeter around their territories, and somewhat inside their territories as well.
So as far as you know, the foxes wouldn't necessarily have some sort of evolved behavior of a different reaction to a place with a bunch of markings versus randomly distributed.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, whether they have different evolved behaviors for one single marking versus a group of markings. I actually don't know that. I think it would be really interesting. It might indicate something else about the environment to them. But to my knowledge, I don't know.
Thanks.
Okay.
So when you were talking about your findings in the Santa Monica Mountains, you were distinguishing between predator and competitor responses for the dogs. And then on the islands of the ringtails, you talked specifically about competitor responses between the ringtails and the cats. Like cats, I know, even though the sizes are closer, that they kind of hunt everything that moves. Do you think there's a possibility that the ringtails are exhibiting more of a predator response? Do you think about that possibility? Is there a way to distinguish?
Yeah, so Kai's question is about the ringtails and about competitor versus predator responses from them and whether I was distinguishing that. That's a really good question. So our understanding from talking to the people that had visited the islands many times over the past few decades is that they did see cats and ringtails fighting, like they would, compete over food. And so we did have actual evidence, like heuristic evidence of that. We don't believe that they necessarily preyed on the ringtails. That would be a pretty large and challenging prey item for a domestic cat. But to your point, like that doesn't mean that the smell of a cat wouldn't be like a bobcat or a mountain lion or something larger that they could cue into. These ringtails have been separated, presumably for many thousands of years. So I think that hypothesis was more about recognizing that threat, period, because for a ringtail, a competitor, a carnivore competitor and a carnivore predator are kind of the same thing. There's not a lot of species that they would compete with that they might not also fear. So for that hypothesis, they were kind of functionally grouped. Yeah. Kobe?
Yeah, so for the ringtails and for the polecat and the mink, those are, the ringtails and the polecats and the polecat and the mink, those are animals that are approximately the same size. For your fox and dog study, I noticed what you requested urine from dogs over 50 pounds. I'm wondering why, and also if there's anything, if there's any evidence that a fox could like infer body size
Yeah.
of the animal based on scent. I don't know.
Yeah, great question. Kobe's question was on the size of the dogs, and whether that could be inferred from their urine. So the reason that they were from dogs over 50 pounds is because UC Davis Vet School has a colony of dogs on site. That colony is only over 50 pounds. So that was just a result of what I could get my hands on. It probably somewhat mimics the experience of the foxes at parks too. You usually see larger dogs on those trails, and you're less likely to see dogs under 50 pounds. As far as whether they can detect sort of the body size from the urine, I'm not sure. I think that's a really interesting question. Yeah, I would probably guess that they would be able to detect things about the body condition, the health, maybe if they're overweight or something like that. But I would guess that they hadn't evolved very specific ways to tune into the body size, because if they're recognizing things about urine for gray foxes, all gray foxes are a little bit of the same size. There's not like the different breeds that we would have for dogs. So my guess would be that they haven't evolved that for body sizes like that. Does that make sense? Cool. Allison?
Super interesting work. I have a couple questions, somewhat related. One question is, I know in certain places the dentistry ringtails as pets in the past. I was wondering, is that rebreeding? And if that's true, that influences their ringtails. And then my second question was, sorry, I have two questions. My second question was, just to know if your results of your research are going to research management actions.
Cool. Thanks, Allison. So you first asked about people keeping ringtails as pets and whether, remind me, whether that
So they're
positive feelings towards ringtails. Yeah, so ringtails have been kept as pets in a lot of parts of the US. There are articles from the 60s and 70s about whether they like hamburgers and things like that. To my knowledge, they weren't specifically kept as pets in the past few centuries in Mexico, but one of the hypotheses for how they got to the islands is that they were brought by the native peoples. So they could have been kept as pets, but I find it, my guess is that it would be hard to keep them in one area. They're very squirrely and like to explore. So there are definitely a lot of sort of legends about ringtails in that area, but none talking about them as pets per se. Despite that, the people in that area love ringtails and are is sort of a mascot of that region. So even without keeping them as pets, they're beloved by that whole area. And whether the results will be implemented in conservation actions. So in the Santa Monica Mountains, I studied foxes in the state parks, at the Stunt Ranch, and on like Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy land. And for the state parks and Stunt Ranch, they already don't allow dogs there. So I find it difficult to understand how their policies would change. If anything, those types of environments might implement what's it called? Like penalties for sort of breaking the rules. To my knowledge, that's not happening, but there's, their own problems with implementing things like that and how that can be, there's a big disparity in who's impacted by those sorts of penalties. So to my knowledge, not in those areas. In the Santa Monica Mountain Conservancy land, I'm pretty certain that those will continue to be used for general recreation. There are policies about not doing commercial dog walking, and that's the same issue with penalties, where it's going to, it probably won't impact people in the ways that we would hope it would. And there could be economic disparities there. A different way to go about that would be to use gray foxes as this charismatic mammal and say, hey, when you're walking your dogs, this is the effect you're having. Doing the best thing and you have the nicest dogs and you're taking care of the environment, they're still impacting the foxes in this way. In Mexico, they have quite a limited capacity to do conservation work right now. However, they are boosting their ability to monitor and conserve the wildlife there, especially through nonprofits. So right now, the role of the federal workers is more to, make sure boats are permitted to be in the area and to really keep track of the mountain lion colonies, not mountain lion, sea lion colonies. But, when we went down there and we did the camera track work, we chose to leave the cameras there so that they were able to continue monitoring the ringtails. And there are nonprofits there to retrieve the cats. So hopefully this will continue to increase support for those efforts on the islands. But there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done in not only surveying the people that use the islands a lot, but also the people whose taxpayer dollars might be going towards those efforts, because not everyone is excited about removing cats. The people that I surveyed were mostly biologists because they were park rangers and ecotourism guides. So there's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done on surveying and interviewing and really creating relationships before actions like that can be done.
Thanks, Maddie.
Thank you.